you know that school lunch was used by the US government to make immigrants more American and less immigrant? Let's take a look back at the late 1800s, early 1900s. Around 25 million people arrived in the US. Early on from the British Isles and Northern Europe, and then later from Southern and Eastern Europe. A lot of these immigrants didn't speak English and held different religious beliefs and ways of life than the earlier settlers.
At night, they go to school to learn the English that will help them to get better jobs.
And the so-called natural-born Americans, basically the older generation of white Europeans that came before these newer white Europeans, didn't like that. So in May 1915, the National Americanization Committee was formed to bring American citizens, foreign-born and native-born alike, together. In other words, they wanted to force immigrants to adopt an American way of life. And school, specifically school lunch, was one tool they used to do that. In the 1920s, children were taught to speak English, learn American history, and eat American food. Back then, this amounted to exciting delights such as cheese sandwiches with American white bread, graham crackers, and milk. School lunches like these were used to Americanize immigrant children all throughout the 1930s. But then the Great Depression hit. There was extreme poverty and malnutrition, and the Roosevelt administration was really concerned, especially with World War II on the horizon. They were afraid that young American men would be too weak to be effective soldiers. So the government hired social scientists and nutritionists, led by anthropologist Margaret Mead, to come up with a plan. And once again, school lunch was the solution. The main goal was to reduce malnutrition and promote healthy eating. But they also saw it as an opportunity to get immigrant children to pledge allegiance to America through food. Now, Mead, to be fair, thought that choice and ethnic diversity should be respected in line with America's democratic culture. But in reality, this didn't happen. Instead of a diverse array of interesting menu options, we actually got a bunch of bland, boring stuff. Quote, "Because of the great diversity of food differences in the United States," Mead said, "it was more sensible to establish feeding patterns which do not offend any group." So school menu planners were encouraged to eliminate, and I quote, "as much distinctive flavoring as possible." In fact, the only recommended seasoning was salt. I'm reading this and I'm like, did this really happen? It did. This resulted in meals like, and I kid you not, a grated carrot sandwich. Thankfully, carrot sandwiches didn't make it to school lunch menus today, but the school lunch menus that I grew up with weren't that much more exciting. So did the school lunch Americanization project actually work? Sort of, but also kind of no. Turns out it was pretty hard to convince immigrants to give up their food and their culture, which is kind of obvious since they still exist. But what the Americanization Initiative did do was establish what American food was. It made it seem like what the immigrant kids were eating at home was not the norm. It effectively drew a line between American and immigrant.